Most people imagine 16th century English cities as quaint places of timbered charm and church bells drifting gently through clean morning air. Yet the truth is that if you had been dropped without warning into York at the height of its northern power, the first sensation forcing its way into your body would not have been awe, but shock, because the air itself pressed against your face like a damp cloth steeped in rot, and before your eyes could even adjust to the narrowness of the streets, your lungs would already be negotiating with the thick mixture of animal blood, human waste, smoke soot, and stagnant water that lingered permanently between the leaning walls. And this is where the myth fractures completely, because York was not a picturesque relic of medieval peace, but a densely packed engine of survival, where nearly half of daily effort was spent simply resisting the slow assault of environment upon flesh. And the deeper truth, the one rarely spoken outside scholarly circles, is that the city's greatness and its discomfort were not opposites but partners, since the very forces that made York powerful also made it physically oppressive. And once you understand that connection, the place transforms from postcard nostalgia into something heavier, something closer to a pressure chamber disguised as a city. Because York in the 1500s was enclosed inside ancient defensive walls that had once protected Romans and later Vikings, and those walls did not expand as population did, so bodies multiplied while space remained fixed, producing a density that forced neighbors into constant contact with one another's heat, breath, noise, and waste. And you would have felt this closeness immediately, not as friendliness, but as pressure. Because every movement required negotiation with someone else's presence. Every step down a lane meant brushing shoulders with a stranger. Every doorway exhaled the smell of whatever life was happening inside. And in such conditions, privacy was not a right but a fantasy, while endurance became the quiet currency that allowed people to function without protest. And if you had stood still for even a minute along one of the narrow snickelways, you would have noticed how the buildings above leaned inward as if trying to seal the sky, their upper stories jutting out over the lower ones to save tax money and conserve ground space, which meant sunlight rarely reached the stones below, leaving the ground permanently damp and slick so that even walking required caution. Because a careless step could send your foot sliding into the shallow gutter that ran along the center, carrying a sluggish ribbon of refuse whose surface shimmered faintly with grease and whose smell shifted depending on what had been emptied into it that morning. And it is important to understand that this was not neglect, but system, not laziness, but infrastructure shaped by limits, since underground plumbing did not exist and waste had to go somewhere, and gravity was the only technology available to move it, so gutters became arteries of the city, carrying away what could not be stored, though they did so imperfectly, often clogging, backing up, or overflowing after rain, until the streets themselves seemed to breathe out a sour humidity. And the famous paving order issued by civic authorities in 1532 was not an aesthetic improvement, but a survival measure, because carts had begun sinking into the mud so deeply that goods could not move, and when goods could not move, hunger followed. And hunger in a city this crowded was not an inconvenience, but a threat that rippled through households like a tightening cord. And you can trace the logic step by step. Mud slows transport. Slowed transport delays food. Delayed food weakens laborers. Weakened laborers reduce production. Reduced production raises prices. And rising prices press hardest on those already living at the edge of endurance, which was most of the population. So the paving stones laid into York streets were not decorative additions, but defensive tools against collapse, each one a slab of practical resistance against the environment's steady attempt to reclaim the ground. And even then the victory was partial, because between those stones muck still gathered, hooves still churned it, boots still carried it indoors, and the smell still clung to clothing, no matter how often garments were brushed or beaten.
And you might think people would complain endlessly under such conditions, yet the remarkable truth is that they rarely did, not because they enjoyed it, but because their bodies had learned to treat discomfort as normal. And this is the quiet strength that defined life here, not dramatic heroism, but daily tolerance, not triumph, but persistence, the kind of resilience that does not announce itself, yet sustains entire cities. And if you walked farther toward the butcher's quarter, known as the Shambles, you would encounter an even sharper lesson in how environment shapes existence, because here the sensory weight intensified, with raw meat displayed openly on wooden shelves, while slaughter took place only steps away, so that the metallic tang of fresh blood mixed with the sweetness of decay and the smoky residue of cooking fires drifting from nearby homes, forming a dense aromatic layer that clung to the back of the throat and coated the tongue with a faint bitterness. And you might instinctively recoil, yet the people working there would barely notice, their senses long accustomed, their attention fixed instead on the rhythm of knives, the heft of carcasses, the calculation of portions, because survival did not pause for discomfort, and the city did not soften itself for anyone. It simply continued, hour after hour, day after day, pressing its weight onto every resident equally, indifferent to preference, unmoved by complaint, functioning like a machine whose gears were made not of metal, but of human endurance.
What made that endurance even more remarkable was that it did not come from strength in the heroic sense people often imagine when they think about the past, but from a quieter and far more demanding adaptation, because the citizens of York did not conquer their environment so much as absorb it into their bodies until discomfort became indistinguishable from routine. And if you had followed one of the city's tradesmen from dawn until dusk, you would have discovered that survival was not a dramatic struggle against catastrophe, but a steady negotiation with countless small physical pressures that never fully stopped, beginning the moment he woke on a mattress stuffed with straw that had long ago lost its softness and now pressed unevenly against his ribs and hips, forcing him to shift positions during the night as the coarse fibers crackled beneath the linen ticking. And when he rose, the air inside his chamber would feel thick rather than fresh, because windows were small and rarely opened wide, designed more to keep out cold and thieves than to invite ventilation. So the first breath of morning carried with it the faint warmth of last night's breath, the smell of wool garments drying on pegs, and the lingering smoke from a hearth that had burned low but never fully died. And already his body would be adjusting, lungs accepting what they were given, skin bracing against chill, muscles tightening as bare feet met the uneven wooden floor whose boards retained the cold of the night. And this was only the beginning, because once he stepped outside, the street pressed back with its own demands, the noise of carts grinding over stone, the wet slap of mud against leather boots, the occasional shove of another passerby who had no room to give way. And all of this contact accumulated, not violently but persistently, creating a background strain that modern minds rarely consider when imagining historical life, since we tend to picture grand events rather than continuous sensations. Yet it was precisely these sensations that shaped behavior, teaching people to move efficiently, to conserve effort, to accept irritation without reaction, because reacting to every discomfort would exhaust a person before noon. And nowhere was this discipline more necessary than in the markets, where trade compressed bodies together so tightly that the air itself seemed to warm from shared breath, and you could feel the presence of others not only through sight and sound, but through temperature, the subtle heat radiating from wool cloaks, the brush of sleeves damp from mist, the smell of leather satchels rubbed with animal fat to keep them supple. And here again the contrast between expectation and reality reveals itself, because markets are often imagined as lively spectacles filled with cheerful bargaining. Yet the truth was more practical and more strained, since buying and selling food was not a pastime, but a necessity, conducted under the constant awareness that supply could falter, prices could rise, and a missed purchase today might mean hunger tomorrow. So conversations stayed brief, movements stayed purposeful, and attention remained fixed on goods rather than scenery. And even the animals threading through the crowd added their own layer of pressure, hooves striking sparks from stone, flanks brushing against coats, breath steaming faintly in the cool air. Each presence another reminder that the city's life depended on motion, and motion depended on endurance, and endurance depended on the body's willingness to tolerate what could not be changed, which was nearly everything, because structures, laws, and customs dictated the boundaries within which individuals lived, and those structures did not bend easily, not for comfort, not for preference, not for complaint. And this is why resilience in York was not loud or celebrated, but silent and constant, expressed in the way a porter lifted yet another sack onto his shoulders despite the ache already spreading across his back, or the way a butcher continued his work while the chill of the morning seeped through his apron stiffened with dried blood, or the way a child carried water along a narrow lane without spilling despite the jostling crowd. Each action small in isolation, yet immense in accumulation, forming the true architecture of the city more surely than timber beams or stone walls ever could. Because buildings only stood while people maintained them, and people only endured while they accepted the conditions surrounding them. And those conditions, indifferent and unchanging, pressed on steadily, shaping posture, breath, patience, and expectation until survival itself became a habit rather than a victory, a daily state achieved not through triumph but through continuation. And the longer you observe this pattern, the clearer it becomes that York's real monument was not its cathedral or its walls, but its inhabitants' capacity to live within pressure without breaking. A capacity so ordinary to them that it passed without remark, even as it carried the entire city forward through another day that asked as much of their bodies as the last and promised no less from the next. And so the next time you picture a grand medieval city rising proudly behind its walls, remember that York's true foundation was not stone or timber, but human endurance, because beneath every tower and market stall lived people who survived not by escaping hardship, but by quietly learning how to breathe inside it.